Thanks again to the Hack at the Harbor sponsors, 6gen, SAIC, Booz Allen Hamilton, Cybercraft, 3F, Cyber Capital Partners, and Point3 Security for making this event possible. With thousands of artificial intelligence engines available and a large, undefined quantity of exploits and implants available through open source and sponsored R&D, several companies are springing up with automated red team solutions, some even to say that their solutions can replace your need to hire and retain human pen testers. Be it resolved, offensive cyber operations personnel can largely be replaced by software. Our speakers are Moose and Vinny Troia. Moose is co-founder and CTO of Randori. He is a recognized expert in digital forensics, vulnerability research, and embedded electronic design. Prior to founding Randori, Moose held executive positions at Kairos Tech, a leading defense contractor, and Mantech, where he oversaw teams conducting vulnerability research, forensics, and offensive security efforts on behalf of government and commercial clients. He holds a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in electrical engineering from the University of Colorado. Vinny Troia is an entrepreneur, investigator, author, and negotiator. Vinny has dived deep into the dark web, tracking down cyber criminals and standing up for US agencies, companies, and individuals. The Hack at the Harbor debates have been following a format of 5-minute opening remarks for each speaker, 10 minutes for each speaker to cross-examine the other, 5 minutes each for closing remarks, and then we will open up the floor to a vote among the audience members, and also the speakers have generously granted us some additional time for questions and answers and further dialogue. So with that said, Moose, you are the pro side of the debate. You have.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I think the place that I always begin when I'm considering the automation conversation for offensive operations is what does offensive operations mean? What does it mean to actually innovate? What are the things that a human is spending their time doing, and what are the lessons we can learn from elsewhere in the technology space? I think if you were to go real fundamental and you think like, Army field manual, or what does like the government consider to be offensive operations, we're really just talking about using capabilities in cyberspace to go achieve some sort of objective. Government space is usually talking about projecting power. Hacking space, we're talking about going and conducting some sort of criminal activity. In the red teaming space, we're talking about emulating or simulating one of those events to try to help folks be able to understand what is it like when somebody hacks me, what's going on. So probably lots of folks have engaged with red teams, lots of folks have engaged with pen tests. There might be a bunch of people on the call or on the audience who have been in hands-on keyboard operations breaking into stuff. And so when I think about offensive operations, where I tend to go is, hey, you have some objective, you're trying to monetize, you're trying to influence policy, you're trying to prove a point, you're trying to get to the domain controller or the code signing keys, and you're going to do the hacking to get to those things. So at kind of my world in Randori, we have this model of innovate once and then automate everywhere. And so when we think about how we're going to go about replacing a group of red teamers, which usually is the thing where people get up in arms and say, oh, you can't replace red teamers. And I'll say, maybe you can't replace red teamers, but we can absolutely replace the bulk of the time that folks end up spending. We see the same pattern play out in every other space where we're engaging in automation, from flying planes to driving automobiles, or scheduling trains across the planet. So the question for me always becomes, what is it that somebody's doing in offensive operations that's innovative, that requires a creative process, that's difficult or maybe impossible to automate? And what are the things that we do that aren't? So what are the things that we do? Where do we spend our time? So when I process the workload of what a person in offensive operations is doing, most of the work that we end up doing in those engagements is what I would call non-innovative, at least by time. So we spend our world in a typical process that might look like analyzing an environment, or analyzing a set of targets, analyzing a network. We're going to follow that with a cross-referencing operation, where we're basically trying to figure out of all of the things in this environment, which of those things map to some known capability, known ability, known technique, known program application tool. And then we're going to go implement that set of known abilities. And then we're going to repeat that process. And then for those of us who have been in government, or those of us who have been in offensive cyber operations for, say, red teaming or pen testing, we're going to go spend a crap ton of our time doing reporting. So essentially, the cycle that we end up being in is very apply process to find stuff, go after a set of analytical processes to map that stuff back to a set of known capabilities, apply those, configure them, run them, and report on what we've done, lather, rinse, repeat. So the upfront analysis, things like scanning a network or searching for targets, cross-referencing, that's going to be things like Googling for known exploits, proof of concepts, Metasploit modules, and then actually running a thing, figuring out if like the Metasploit plugin that we wish to apply is actually going to work in this place. If I can pull it in, I can make it happen, get on target, then continue my process from there. So when we think about the operations that we're doing, a bulk of the time that ends up getting spent is repetitive in nature. There's absolutely spots that are creative, right? We end up doing vulnerability research on occasion. I've heard lots of pen testers over the years tell me that they want to spend more time writing tools. They want to spend more time doing vulnerability research. But what we see is that in this total life cycle, there's a tremendous opportunity for expertise to be automated. And while there's still required tremendous expertise to like do your job, that expertise is largely experiential in the application of previously implemented solutions and less about the creation of new and novel solutions and kind of the day-to-day by hours of the day at least.
Thank you for your opening remarks. Vinny, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I was muted. Appreciate it. So my name is Vinny Troia. I do run a company called Shadowbyte. We do, a bit of penetration testing ourselves. At least that's how we started. And I will say, I do agree with Moose in a number of areas. There is a level of automation that occurs and redundancy, especially when you're looking, performing initial network scans and vulnerability scans. The problem I find is that every network is different. And so depending on, potentially your starting database of vulnerabilities, which, is more or less pretty common anyway, you may run into some issues because every network is different and you can't necessarily, if you're talking about just scanning and taking an inventory of machines, sure, no problem. And then checking that against known vulnerabilities. The problem is, what a real red team does, I think, and what often gets confused when you talk about engagements with, let's say, accounting firms or some of the bigger, firms that maybe just throw, low-level employees at customers and call it a pen test. The reality is, it's not just a glorified vulnerability scan. It's actual teams of people looking for either misconfigurations in software, vulnerabilities, sure. More often than not, when you get into organizations that have some level of security in place, finding an exploitable vulnerability is much more difficult and much less common. It often comes down to, finding some sort of misconfiguration either in Windows or in whatever software we're talking about. And I'll go into examples of that a little bit later. But the best hackers look for specific attack vectors that are unique to each organization. And so when we talk about the idea of automating a process to do that, and maybe that's not the intent of the software, maybe it is just to find the almost like a macro where you find the most common exploits that work for most organizations and then you rinse and repeat. Perhaps that would work for maybe half of, or maybe for companies that don't have, or maybe that have similar or don't have much in the way of a security posture. But again, as you get into more difficult environments and more secure environments, you do actually, I would think, spend most of your time looking for innovative approaches for, number one, even being able to properly analyze an entire network of hosts and machines can be tricky in itself just because of firewalls and segmentations and ACLs and all of that fun stuff. So once you are able to get a map of the network, which, by the way, most organizations don't even have themselves, then it's a question of finding the right yeah, I mean, just coming up with the right method to kind of dig through and, basically which holes to poke at. So Metasploit, I find, and so just to preface this, I mean, I've literally been hacking all my life. I mean, this is how I started my company. I mean, this is what we were based on. And I rarely use Metasploit because I find that Metasploit is more of, okay, well, this is sort of the cookie cutter stuff that's been out there, and that's great, but it's more about using sort of offensive tools that are a little bit more bleeding edge, things that have been put out at conferences, in places like that, so that we can find ways around maybe known Windows misconfigurations. Maybe we load something specific into memory, or we find a way to bypass UAC in a certain way that's unique, or maybe we generate a custom malicious, some sort of custom malicious string that we can inject into Windows memory. It's not really, I've never really seen a clean way to automate that. And so, at least in my perspective, it's always going to come down to having, the right people for the job, people who know, who've been doing this for a long time, who really know where to find the holes to poke at and how to poke at them, if you will. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, for your opening statements. Moose, you have 10 minutes to cross-examine. You can counter an argument you heard from Vinny. You can ask some questions. Perhaps you have some new thoughts or want to continue on thoughts. The floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Oh man, 10 minutes. And then Vinny gets to beat me up, so I got to be nice enough here, right? Yeah, I think the expertise is an interesting question, right? And what we mean by expertise, and then it'd be interesting to explore a little bit what we mean by replacing the bulk of the time. So if I were to go to, say, flying an airplane, or if I were to go to like the thing that we're seeing emerge with driving an automobile today, where there's tremendous attention that's required, through the journey of an automobile. And now we're seeing technologies be deployed that are taking the rote components of driving, say, starting with something like lane assist and progressing to like Ford's got their approach for the blue lanes, like we can automatically drive in the places where the highway goes straight. And over the course of history, we'll see this develop from a human has to be attentive all of the time to the human has to be attentive part of the time to the human has to be attentive very little of the time. Maybe we never get all of the way, but the objective becomes that. So I think it's an interesting nugget to see that pattern occur. And I'm always wondering to myself, like, I like hackers. I like the idea of having hacked my whole life as well. And I like to think that we are somehow unique and special snowflakes in the history of human evolution. But I kind of doubt it at the end of the day, right? I'm always like, are we really fundamentally different than manufacturing or any other major space? And the pattern that I actually have seen emerge is that the vast majority of what happens is, yeah, we're applying a tool, and that tool might be difficult or specialized or required expertise to deploy well. But when you're referring to something like, I rarely use Metasploit, agree in principle, I would say, like, I have also rarely used Metasploit in my life and do prefer to use bleeding edge capabilities. But when we're talking about like a tool that's been released at a conference to help us find a misconfiguration, that's still a tool at the end of the day. And so if you can take your expertise, would it not be time beneficial for you to be able to apply that expertise one time and then reapply it for any place that technology reapplies, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and especially, and I will say, when you talk about, what was the name of that? When those NSA tools were leaked, Eternal Blue, right? I mean, that sort of thing was everywhere. And so that was just being exploited left and right. And so automating that process of even kind of loading out the VMs that you would need, in an engagement and sort of going through those motions and sort of, it's almost like, let's check off the major stuff first that we know is being popped left and right, right? And so, in that case, sure, absolutely. I mean, I actually agree with you. I mean, let's make sure that the company isn't vulnerable to Eternal Blue, and let's do our tests to make sure that, let's run these within the network. Let's run these tools within the network. Let's make sure that all of those don't work. But I see that as maybe phase one of the process. Let's check for low-hanging fruit, and then when that's done, then sure, I would say we move on to more like manual, like hardcore red teaming.
So how much time in a red team engagement that you do today do you spend on the high-end stuff versus the commoditizable stuff then?
Honestly, most of it. The first step we usually do, after we pull together a list of the infrastructure, then we'll do a vulnerability scan of everything, right? So that's the first step. And then once we have sort of our base list, then it's usually, depending on who I have assigned to what team. I mean, people have their methods, and maybe to some extent, some of those methods are repeatable. But I mean, I've actually seen people gain Windows admin credentials through a faulty print spooler. So some people get really unique with how they're doing things. And a lot of times it comes down to just simply being able to see what's on the network itself. So I would say actually the majority of our time, if not what's spent on the reporting, which always is, takes a fun minute, is pretty unique and standard or non-standard.
Yeah, that's an interesting nugget. I think visibility is a place that I would opine is a very solvable problem in terms of almost whole automation. In that, I think at Render we've done a pretty good job of actually building technology that does a good job of automating that. And I think you can accomplish it even in the presence of ACLs or other dynamic network infrastructure environments. Because what I've found over kind of the career is that, I guess I didn't find it, it's just the truth of the internet, that we don't actually build fundamental technologies for new environments, right? We leverage foundational technology and we use the same common building blocks in order to build our networks. So everybody's deploying the same sets of technologies, ostensibly following related or similar best practices. And obviously the misconfigurations become interesting to locate, but the scope or the breadth of the variation that can occur is fairly limited in the scheme of the universe by the fact that all the technology at the core is the same stuff. So what we've been able to kind of note over the history of breaking into stuff is that, yeah, you see variation, but for the enumeration components, you can automate the processes of enumerating. And what we've seen over the course of monitoring a bunch of network environments across a large number of customers is that, hey, the foundational technologies they use, the products they use, the software that's deployed has a lot of commonality across customer environments. So if you can use a little bit of automation and put some thought into how you capture work from an innovator, so someone like yourself, what you can find is that instead of going one-to-one, you can look for one-to-many, right? And you can break the binding of I do a service engagement to an individual or to a small set of organizations that I'm working with, to working against a large set of organizations and planning in a different way. And what that unlocks is the ability to break the paradigm. And so even if you can't replace every instance of human innovation that's necessary, you can apply the human innovation at a broad scale, and then you can reduce the need of folks like you and me to hire an infinite number of hackers to go after an infinite number of customers, and instead leverage a small number of hackers to go after a much larger number of customers, which has the same net effect. Is there a particular reason that you don't think that you could automate pivoting through a print spooler? Just out of curiosity, is a nugget that you're chewing there?
No, maybe the print spooler one was a bad example, but I'll say I think if you take if even some of the, I've seen some great hackers post videos on YouTube of different methods and techniques and things they do, and there's even one company called Snap Attack that does similar work in that regard, where they post some pretty impressive hacks and how they do things, and they try to almost create a macro effect like what you're talking about. But so I'll give you an example. So one of the things that we would do a lot, there's a tool called SMB Relay, and what this would do is this would look for whether or not SMB, which is transfer protocol within Windows version maybe 1 or 2 was installed over version 3, and this isn't something that's necessarily flagged as a vulnerability. In fact, I think if you have SMB1, it's actually flagged as a low priority item, which is misconfiguration. But using SMB Relay, you can actually start to you create a man-in-the-middle effect on a person's network and start gaining Windows tokens, and eventually use those, if you find the right admin token to, elevate your status and do all this other cool stuff on the network. And I think, that was a technique we used for a little bit. So I think to some extent that probably could have been maybe automated, especially if you do it enough times. But at the time, I will say there was really nothing like that, just because this was so bleeding edge when we were doing it, that, having the ability to incorporate tools like even other tools like Empire and Death Star were another, or NTLM Relay X, or, things. I mean, there's just so many of these little tools that you would have to incorporate that I don't know how. I mean, maybe you could have someone keep up with it, but I think even being able to track the output of, of the tools that are running to make sure that, you've got some sort of legitimate token that you can use to elevate, like actually finding the domain controller token, or if you can't do it that way, finding access to a person's machine and then pivoting from that person's machine who may have a little bit higher access to get that domain admin token. So it's just, a lot of it is just trial and error, I feel.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I guess I would close my cross-examination by saying that I think that most of the parameterizable and enumeration cases are things that we can automate, even if it's difficult to do so.
Thank you, Moose, for the floor. Vinny, you can keep the conversation going. You can counter an argument. It's your time to run. Get 10 minutes.
Sure. So actually, I'd like to ask some questions. So Moose, on your end, I mean, can you give some examples of things that you have successfully, or like processes that you've successfully automated that maybe are repeatable, or you find, maybe common?
Yeah, for sure. So from the outset, I said that we've done a pretty phenomenal job of enumeration and reconnaissance. So one of our first goals as a company was for a hacker on our hacker operations center, our red team, to never have to go run a network scan or do software enumeration at the outset. So we start with that. We've been able to fully automate the process of deploying and pivoting. So once we have an exploit in the corpus of capabilities and we're putting down a tool, be that one of our own custom implants or a commoditized implant, that process from decision to exploit through to the pivoting into a network environment and being able to pump packets into that network space is now like a wholly automated thing. Credential stuffing, phishing, infrastructure deployment, all of these are solvable problems. I'll say that while things like the volume of tool, right, and the rate of tools development is like certainly a thing that's worth tracking, and there's always new work to go develop. There's always new stuff to go find. Like certainly I'd rather have a team having to track what's going on in the world and staying like focused on the cutting edge pieces and never have to repeat running a capability. So we wrote a blog post recently from one of our hackers who had come up with an interesting technique in credential theft using, I don't want to name any particular applications, but there's a bunch of asset management platforms that do enumeration and may not handle credentials in the clearest manner. And so, the process of going from like, hey, I'm going to pretend to be a thing on the network to, hey, you're going to give me a credential to, hey, I'm going to enumerate all the places in the network that this credential can apply. That also becomes a wholly automatable component. And as we build up this corpus over time, you can see the pattern where, innovate once, automate everywhere, and you automate enough things and you start to be able to deliver the experience that's indistinguishable from, like air quotes, true red team, and really focus our resources and our efforts onto the pieces that are pushing the bounds of what we're able to do.
All right, so let's say, I don't disagree with anything you said, right? Assuming you have, the right people sort of hacking away at things and, you stay up with the latest techniques, I think maybe, there are certain aspects that absolutely can and probably should be automated. So then let's, maybe shift gears a little bit and talk about everybody's favorite part of a pen test, which is the reporting. I've spent many years of my life writing reports, unfortunately, and this is often, I find, as critical as the test itself. And, for me and, for us, this was a lot of trial and error at the beginning of finding a format that works in a way that executives specifically can understand. Because when you give them a pen test report and you give them a bunch of technical, nobody wants to see anything technical. That's the first thing I find. I mean, all they really care about is they want a summary. Just give me a high level list of what it is, because nobody's going to read past the first page anyway, in most cases. So how do you compensate for that? Or do you not really get into the report part of it?
Yeah, it's reporting, yes, always do it. Second, yes, nobody's going to read past the first sentence. And then if we've got like a bunch of college kids in the audience and you're ever doing PowerPoint presentations, people are paying attention. If they ever repeat the word in the bottom right of a slide, most people will stop at the top left. I think to answer your question though, Vinny, I think the question really comes down to what are the metrics that matter? How can you measure those metrics, and how can you give them to the people that are going to consume them? A CEO who should be very interested in the status of a security program really shouldn't care about the day-to-day of whether we patched exploit X, Y, or Z, whether there's a particular capability. Like, none of that matters in their world. What they really need to care about is, have we gotten good return on investments? Are the bets that I've made and the money that we've spent been worth it, right? And that's a business conversation that needs to occur, and what a CISO or a security practitioner needs to be able to provide in order to have that conversation to the executive suite are metrics. And some of that needs to be self-improvement over time. Some of that needs to be pure analytical, right? How am I doing compared to industry norms or other data points? So where I put all of my focus from like the Randori perspective is in what are metrics that are effective to driving change that matters, and what are the things that we can measure. So while the narrative story of a red team engagement is often very interesting in the purple engagement where you're trying to like train the blue team, you can provide that framework from a play-by-play to the blue teamers. On the metrics side, I think it's much more important just to measure, hey, what was the actual time to compromise or time to evict, time to detect? And the great news about the SOAR and XDR and other platforms that we see being built across the rest of the security stack is that if you're acutely measuring or accurately measuring all of the individual steps of an attack engagement at a very granular level, you can really precisely integrate. You can integrate and then very precisely answer questions like, what was the exact time to a first detection? When did a human respond? And how has that trended over time? And then if you automate at scale and you can integrate at scale, you can start pulling data from industry and saying, how is this trending compared to peers or sibling organizations or like organizations?
Fair enough. And I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I will bring up sort of an interesting edge case. Okay. A few years ago, at one of the Black Hats, I listened to Charlie Miller give a really interesting talk on hacking cars. I don't remember if it was a Tesla or whatever it was. And it was a really long presentation, and he had easily 80 slides in his deck of all the steps that they took and all of the cool misconfigurations that occurred basically in each step of the way, right down to, certain areas not even having passwords in place to protect, going to the next stage. And, eventually maybe that step would be repeatable, but I mean, it takes those innovators to go out and find those flaws to begin with. And, it's always going to be that situation as networks and, infrastructure get more and more complex, right? And so, at least from my perspective, if you're solely relying on automated tools, I think you're going to miss quite a bit. I think, the automated tools are a great first step, and maybe they'll, knock out 50% of the workload, right? Which is great. But then it really requires having, the people with the capacity to learn from those tools to then, further the engagement and say, okay, well, these checkboxes were automatically ticked off. Now let's start from here and sort of go forward. So, I would never, fully load an engagement with strictly automated tools. I feel like it's a disservice to the customer, but I would agree that it is a great first step.
Yeah, I think the automobile cases are always really fascinating. I think the bio that Evan gave earlier indicated that I used to do like embedded systems design and similar early in my career.
That's
and so when I it's like, so when I look at something like a car, there's kind of two ways that I want to take it, right? Everybody's buzzing about IoT today, and as we look at like the proliferation of connected technologies, it could look at the car as a box and say this is akin to a printer or a telephone, and in many senses it would be, right? But I can also go the other direction and say like, hey, this is also a thing that is itself a fairly complex network environment made of modular components that are built by shared organizations with standardized components. And so something like a CAN bus used for coordinating signaling between the braking system and an ECU, or between an ECU and a head unit, or the fact that like BlackBerry is producing the OS for a head unit, or an ECU is produced using a standardized RTOS, right? So we end up in this componentry environment where each of these things is kludged together in much the same way that somebody's network would be. So while I don't have a lot of customers asking me today to do penetration tests inside their automobiles in a particularly automated way, I think the pattern of application is the same. And as we start seeing, like, if for some reason everybody pivoted their business networks to running on CAN bus, all of a sudden automation tools that we might use to apply techniques at scale in a business network would suddenly apply to the car as well. And I'd be able to take Charlie from spending a lot of time doing human innovation, trying to figure out how to pivot and touch and interact, to being able to maximize the time to a really small amount of mandatory innovation.
Sure. And what about, actually, I mean, I will say, and maybe this is outside of your scope, but now I'm just curious, networks have changed so much in the last year and a half due to COVID. With everybody now working from home, that model has changed significantly from being in sort of an at-home AD environment to just, working from home and connecting to whatever using a VPN. So the model of pen testing has changed, in my opinion, considerably, because now, the focus has become, how do I hack the person versus, necessarily trying to elevate within the network first. It becomes more of almost like a social engineering engagement. So I'm curious how you guys would compensate for something like that.
So that is time, and Moose can answer in his closing arguments, or we can wait until after the debate for continued dialogue. We got a program to keep, and so. So thank you, though. So take notes and save it for later. Vinny, you have 5 minutes for closing remarks to articulate your argument.
Okay. Well, I guess to recap, looking at what a true red team does I mean, just look holistically, just looking at what a red team does. The idea is to emulate what potential adversary attacks are, and whether or not there's any exploitable items within the network that can be used to do whatever, right? I mean, is there something exploitable on the network, and can we get to it? Oftentimes companies will have compensating controls, sort of like a band-aid fixes around those exploitable items that they know are there, and they just can't fix them, whether they be old bugs that literally can't be patched for fear of breaking everything else, or I mean, there's so many circumstances there. So oftentimes we'll see literal like band-aid fixes, like just in a around the item. So being able to uncover that and being able to really drill down into that, or even if those situations don't exist, just being able to figure out what the network looks like, and planning an approach to how to get to whatever your core objective is, whether it is to steal a piece of data as part of your engagement, or to gain admin credentials. Figuring out that sort of flight path to get from A to B to C to D, etc. In my mind, still requires a level of human innovation. I mean, I don't think that technology has evolved to the point where it's smart enough to necessarily pivot on its own. There are certain situations where I think, sure, if A, then B, and then if B, then C, you can do, but I'm not necessarily sure that those would apply in every situation. So, I'm always going to be a big advocate of having the right people for the job who can understand and quickly think on their feet, and, really help with the core objectives, which is to, number one, ensure that there is nothing that can be exploited, and if there is, making sure you find it. So And then again, the last part of it is making sure that, once you have finished an engagement, that you can convey everything that you've done in a way that makes sense to, to the stakeholders of the project. It's not just a question of having, hey, we found this was the path we took to exploit. We need to be able to show a list of, risks that were uncovered within. Maybe sometimes there are vulnerabilities that need to be patched. Maybe maybe it becomes a string of items that need to be fixed as a result of, this one exploitable thing that we did, but it needs to be presented in a way that's readable and digestible by, the people who matter in the project, which is, everybody matters, but the stakeholders that have hired you to do the job. So even again, from that perspective, I think it really takes that human capability to be able to kind of read and dissect that and then synthesize something that works for the customer, because at least from my perspective, almost every report is different. It takes a level of, it takes effort to understand what the client exactly is looking for, and then make sure you give them a report that satisfies what they want. And so I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you, Vinny. Moose, you have 5 minutes for closing remarks.
Awesome. I love having the timer because otherwise I would just ramble forever. So that's good. I think, I'm going to go back to a question that I think Vinny was starting to ask me, and I use that to frame my closing remarks here, which is, as we've seen this transition to this work from home world, and we've kind of had this change in how businesses and networks and organizations are structured and operated, we've totally seen at Randori that that's changed the way that you manage and collect scope, and it's changed the way that you interact, and it's changed the way that you reach. But because we've been able to use automation to enable mapping of organizations and networks and collecting scope and having dynamic agreements between customers and us about how we can engage, that's made that a more approachable transition than it might have been if we were strictly in kind of the manual mindset. For one, I'm very excited about the prospects of having a human be the thing that we're trying to hack for initial access, as opposed to software in many cases, because as my terror-inducing nightmares about marketing firms have made me realize, we're actually way better at convincing humans to do dumb stuff with AI than we are at finding vulnerabilities in software or applications. And so I look at the marketing teams and I have to bow down and say, man, you guys have figured out how to hack way better than I have, and you've automated the crap out of it. So mad respect. I think as I look at the premise of the question, right, can we replace operations personnel, right, offensive operations personnel with automation? I think I look at it as maximizing automation really means that we're able to effectively get rid of these people by redefining what they have to do, what a human has to do, right? By maximizing the productivity via automation, the same way every other industry has. We can kind of redefine what the red teamer has to do. I don't think we ever get away from the need for innovation, but I think we can get away from the need for a person to ever be wasting their time on anything that isn't strictly innovative. And what we'll find is that we can maximize the available time to apply that human capability to the problems that are uniquely human, and the things that we would have recognized as an offensive operations operator in the past would simply cease to exist in the future by leveraging that technical and automated development to help us move forward. So I hope that folks believe that we can in fact replace all of these really brilliant people, because I want to replace them with themselves doing kind of a different job to help the customers achieve the same larger net effect, just at a greater scale, at a greater efficiency, driving much more efficiency in the workforce, the way we've seen it in every other workforce, kind of throughout the experience of human development over time. So getting the flashcard that says 2 minutes left, I'm actually going to pause there, having consumed 3 minutes, and see if we can spare some extra time for Q&A or wherever the moderation crew would like us to take it. Vinny, it's been a lovely conversation at this point. Thanks for taking it.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you so much.
All right. I believe the term is the balance of time has been yielded back to something. I'm not quite sure either. So anyway, thank you, speakers. All right, Hack at the Harbor audience members. The matter brought before you is, be it resolved, OCO personnel can be largely replaced by software. Please take a moment to vote for the most persuasive side of the topic. And while that's happening, again, we're opening up the floor to audience members for questions. Feel free to pose questions to either of the speakers using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom interface. And while you're formulating your questions, I would once again like to remind you that if you have not yet registered for tomorrow's Escalate Capture the Flag, you can do so throughout the day at the hyperlink that you'll find in the Zoom chat. And I would also once again like to remind you that if you purchase Escalate between now and Monday, you'll get 25% off, no coupon codes needed. To join the community, head over to https://escalate.today. All right, with announcements out of the way and a very tight voting scheme here, with 55% of the vote, I agree with David Moose Wolpoff that offensive personnel can be replaced by software. So congratulations, Moose. Thanks for playing, Vinny. With the debate formally out of the way, we have questions kind of rolling in. So the first question I think goes to Moose, and that is one of the reasons hackers are so successful is that some tool is built and it provides a red X or a green check, and people just love to believe that green check. And so if we take your argument to the extreme and we've automated scanning and response actions, we're running a script, albeit a very complex script, but effectively we're getting towards that green check. Does that green check present the same false sense of security as we've seen for decades, or are automated red team solutions truly changing the landscape?
Oh man, I will say that I don't want to say hate, but I hate most of what happens in cybersecurity today. I think we get a lot of spend that isn't really worth it, and we get a lot of false security. The place that I actually see the most value from automated red teams is just being able to deliver experience at scale. But I can explain something for you, I can't understand it for you. I think the thing that we need to see in the industry is less green checks, fewer red X's. We need to see more, defenders understanding, knowing what good defense looks like, and practicing, what I would call dedicated best practices. Kind of my career, both in automation and in manual red team services, has been that, folks who do old school defense in depth, default deny, network segmentation, logging, monitoring, visibility, are really effective at defending. And those that don't are really ineffective at defending. And it's less about, do I have a bunch of bugs in my environment, and more about, do I know my home turf, and do I operationalize my home turf advantage? So the benefit to me of automation is really that we can test, we can retest, we can test at depth, and we can test comprehensively with fewer people in much grander places, as those grand places are changing. I think there's automation on the defensive side that's helping people cope with rate of change in their environment, but it doesn't obviate the need for folks to have expertise about what good security architecture looks like, although automation is absolutely changing the way in which people can apply it.
Did you have anything to add?
No, I feel like that was pretty good. I think, it's funny when I love that you brought up defense in depth, because, now the buzzword is zero trust, right? And it's like, okay, this is the same thing we've been doing for 20 years now, but that's all right. Relying solely on those check marks is really dangerous. Just because, you have a whole bunch of green check marks today doesn't mean you'll have them tomorrow, or doesn't mean that, the system that's generating them knows to look for everything that may be specific to your environment. So I'm never a fan of solely relying. I mean, that's why, the whole idea of, vulnerability scans are really interesting to me. It's like a vulnerability scan should just be almost the same as, okay, well, I'm just taking an inventory of your network. This really isn't anything else here. But some people will use that as sort of like the holy grail. It's like, okay, well, we have no vulnerabilities, so we're totally safe. We've got all the green check marks. Yeah, not really. So I would just be careful.
Yeah, we've got no vulnerabilities that you know about, right?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So let me follow up on that. Another good question that came in was something Vinny had said earlier, that he would never have his team like fully load up on engagement solely using automated tools. And it seems better that if we have all the known techniques, right? The MITRE ATT&CK framework has this matrix of 100 different techniques, and like let's say we can create all the permutations through software, right? And now you've got like more science and less art. Right? So the question then is like, if we could conceivably come up with software that can automate all the techniques, what's the problem with replacing a human operator who may have biases towards one or forget to run a couple of others, and replace that with software that will run through every single permutation equally across all engagements?
I personally don't think you're ever going to be able to get to that point where you're going to have every known sequence or every known pattern or attack pattern just down. I think you can probably capture and automate maybe a lot of the most common ones, and maybe you'll get 80% of the cases, right? But when you start talking about the outliers and the real edge cases that often matter during a large pen test engagement, I don't know if that's necessarily going to fly, and I wouldn't rely on that either. I think I'll admit it's a good kind of initial step, right? To make sure, okay, well, let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. Let's run through all this, and let's save our own time and money, using this tool and doing it this way. But then it's like, okay, well, now we got to roll up our sleeves and actually, do the checking ourselves to make sure the software hasn't missed anything, or make sure there isn't something that we can't figure out along the way.
I think the thing that I would add to what Vinny has said there, the notion of running all of the techniques, right, or having all of the green check boxes across your MITRE framework, or MITRE matrix, I think that's a great nugget, but it doesn't help you understand whether your security architecture is done right. The fact is that there are buckets in the MITRE framework that are kind of infinite in and of themselves that I can implement in ways that you might not detect it with your current detection technique, or you might not even have the detection technique in the right place, right? When you're assessing the security of a network, you need to be able to test independent of assumptions, including the design assumptions of the network. Like, did you put the tools in the right place? Does the segmentation make any sense? And then you need to be able to think, I think, categorically, right? So if you look at something like the history of vulnerabilities, or a specific vulnerability, like every vulnerability was in a network at some point and we didn't know it was there. And so by definition, you can't scan like with a vulnerability scanner or a test for the thing that you don't know is there. But by enumerating test cases, right, you can check for similar vulnerabilities if your structure and architecture are correct. And so if you think about it in like layers, not just like network layers, but in controls on top of controls, it's necessary not to just get like the breadth in one place, but also the breadth across the network, right?
Awesome. All right, audience, keep rolling in those questions. The next one is for Moose. So you had mentioned in your debate that you like the idea of innovating once and then automating everywhere. And much of an attacker's work is really repetitive and thus can be automated. And actually both speakers also mentioned that like reporting takes a hell of a lot of time. So if most of the work is automatable, then why don't we automate the reports? Make them boilerplate.
Well, yeah, I'd say like I put a lot of work in my team into specifically that. How do you automate the reports, automate the content, automate the capture of information so that you don't have to do the repetitive components? I also think that as we move from a point-in-time assessment to a continuous or an ongoing assessment, mentality, the concepts that we have of kind of reporting as we've thought about them historically don't necessarily apply in the same ways. And the fundamental problems you're trying to solve with reporting, you may need to solve in different ways. And so we're kind of looking at it from both angles. One is, how do we capture all the information? How do we make sure that customer can engage with a product and service in a way that lets them get the red team experience and engage with that partner in a continuous manner, capture those learnings in a continuous manner, but also be able to get the like checkbox, snap to line, get a report, have an artifact that I can share around. And these are both, kind of, largely automatable, if not completely automatable, things that you just need to do.
I'm going to jump in and say I actually agree with you from when you're talking about scanning on a continuous basis and not, a single point in time, then the reports get geared the reports are geared for the technical people, because they're the people who are going to be kind of doing the fixes, and, the executives aren't going to want to see those reports all the time. I mean, they're just not going to care. But I guess, I'm always more looking at it from, when you hit the reporting phase, you're doing more of like what's a risk assessment model. You're putting together however you want to structure it, right? But it's a much more tailored report for the organization based on their own needs and whatever else the thing is. But, at this point, I think we're talking about two different animals, right? I mean, having that those automated tools to go in and do the checks, or really just sort of become one component of that final, assessment, versus, having reporting that is used, or that is generated continuously or monthly or whatever the frequency is. It's just a different beast, I think.
All right, it looks like we have one more question, and probably time for one more question. So again, thank you all for staying a little bit past the debate. This is not really directed towards either of you, so feel free to both jump in. It seems like throughout the debate, there was a distinction between people who perform the operations and people who then use their experience performing operations to develop novel techniques. And if we're going down the path of replacing those operators with software, then who's going to get the experience to then develop the new techniques to make the next generation of software?
Well, I think that's kind of the point, right? And that's why there's always going to be that level of human interaction that's needed. I think, I mean, you can automate all of the basic things, all of the initial checks. But then once you've exhausted that, you need the team or the person to be able to innovate based on the environment and say, okay, well, now that, all this stuff is done, I can really focus on, some of maybe the cooler stuff that I've been wanting to try, or maybe write some of my own exploits, or just do whatever it takes to, achieve that objective.
Yeah, I think there exist different passions and different motivators as well. So I've known folks who just love the puzzle and love tearing something apart, and the folks who are amazing, binary reverse engineers have a particular mentality that just wants to disassemble the Rubik's Cube and figure out how it works and put it back together, and out pops a capability. There are absolutely folks I've met who really love being an expert in how to use something like Metasploit. And oftentimes the difference between a successful operation and a non-successful operation is just like knowing what the parameter is that you have to type something in and being able to do that in a smooth way. So I think that I don't underestimate the drive of folks to follow their passions and go after the things that really motivate them. So I don't think we're at any risk of losing the desire to solve interesting problems. But I think there is a question about the capacity and the timing. I've actually been very fascinated by the bug bounty space, where you've kind of seen this proliferation of people who suddenly had an economic incentive to go look for particular types of bugs, right? And then had the economic incentive to try to go maximize the impact of the research that they had done. And now you have a cohort of people who are building tools that they're publishing on the internet that, hey, I wrote this thing that helps me find these bugs on these bug bounty engagements. And then what's going to happen is exactly what Vinny said, right? You'll exhaust the well, as it were, for the types of capabilities that this thing is able to find, and then that person is going to be incented to go find some other clever thing that they could do, and you'll see the pattern repeat itself. And so it never ends, right? Because the pace of human innovation and the change of technology won't end, but it's certainly a entertaining cycle to watch, and I look forward to being able to capitalize on that innovation as it takes place.
Awesome. Thank you both of you for your time. Thank you all.